All right, so thanks again for doing this. My first question to you is tell me a little bit about yourself and just kind of how you got in the community. What was that journey like?
Ah, so my name is Eve Wiley. I am, I feel like this question's always so hard because it's like, do I go with the 5 minute answer or the 50-minute answer? So how I got into the community, my parents struggled with infertility and they used an anonymous sperm donor. So they went to their fertility doctor and they gave him this sheet of paper with donors on it from California Cryobank, and they selected donor 106, and that's how I was born. Um, they had me, and then 4 months later, they were pregnant again, but this time it was naturally with my dad's biological child. And so I have a little sister who's 14 months younger. So that father passed away when I was 7 years old. And with my little sister being the biological child of my dad, my mom really wanted to know what was my medical information as well. So she started the process for me. And this was like, way back before Facebook groups and just how like donor sibling registry and how connected we are now. And when I was 16, I found those emails, and that's when I found out I was donor conceived. And that kind of started my, initial journey into the donor conceived community. But it wasn't until I was 30 years old that I figured out that I was part of what we call the donor deceived community. So my son was really, really sick, and he ultimately had celiac disease. And we didn't know any of that because we weren't reporting, if it's like a genetic thing in the family. I wasn't reporting it because I didn't know about it. So we do a commercial DNA test, 23andMe plus health, and I send it to the doctor, the raw genetic DNA. And the doctor comes back and says, this is autoimmune disorder and it's celiac disease and it's coming from my side. And so, are you familiar with the profiles like the 23andMe and Ancestry?
Yes, I am. Yeah.
So that I wasn't, I mean, this was like 2017, 2018. So I knew there was the genetic side of it, but I was so focused on what I was using it for, the health reasons. And so I had all these connections to these half siblings, but I thought they were first cousins because it said close family to first cousins. It doesn't give you that immediate, or half sibling match. So the doctor says your son has celiac disease, autoimmune disorder, comes from my side. I talked to the sperm donor who I call dad. We have like this beautiful, wonderful relationship. He officiated my wedding too. And he doesn't have the autoimmune disorder either. So then I talked to one of my half siblings, and he's from like, the small town that I'm from, and I have a bunch of them, right? And then I talked to a first cousin, and I thought that I was over here dropping this bomb on him saying, and this is what happened to the donor conceived community. It's usually someone is that first domino that says, you're donor conceived or you're adopted or whatever it is. And he's the one that was like, no, we're first cousins. So I was like, okay, if you're my first cousin, then it means that Steve is your uncle. And he said, no, that's not my uncle. My uncle is Kim McMorris. And that's when my world just stopped because Kim McMorris is my mom's fertility doctor. So what the truth ultimately was is that my mom's fertility doctor swapped his own sperm for the sperm donor that they intended, and he's my biological father. And that is how I found myself in this crazy world that I feel like I now am a part of.
Mm-hmm. So tell me a little bit about your role at the Husan Center. I understand that you work with people with disabilities. Correct me if I'm wrong, but could you talk a little bit about that?
So here at the Housing Center, we do psychoeducational evaluations as well as therapy. So what we do is we diagnose learning disorders. So think of dyslexia, dysgraphia, dyscalculia, ADHD, language processing, everything that you would need for, in Texas, what we have is a 504 plan to get certain accommodations for education. So we do those psychoeducational evaluations, and then we also have a therapy team that I work with. I'm clinical director, of training here. And so through that, we help with like executive functioning skills for our kiddos with attention weaknesses. Or we also have a speech team. So when it comes to language processing or language weaknesses, then there are things that that they can address that helps them along in their education. We also do certain like we're starting to look into like different modalities to be more inclusive because I feel like in the therapy space, ironically, um, I think we're just now getting to the point where there is more inclusivity instead of just treating things very compartmentalized, which is kind of, what we're focusing on now.
Mm-hmm. So my next question is, what sorts of methods or approaches do you use when, working with patients?
Yeah, so like in what way? Like for testing purposes or therapeutic purposes?
Therapeutic purposes.
So I think it kind of depends on really on the person and what they're presenting with. So for our neurodiverse community with ADHD and ADD, I actually work more with parents because I feel like I see a lot more progress when working with parents. What we know with our kiddos with attention weaknesses is they get a lot of negative feedback, especially in an educational setting that has so many demands on them to be still, pay attention, that neurologically they just can't do. That's just not the way that their brain works. So I do a lot of helping teachers and parents really meet them at their part of the world because we don't want them to exist in a classroom or a home setting that isn't compatible with their neurology. So we want to be able to validate and normalize that neurodivergency so that way we can help people kind of adjust and meet them at their part of the world. So there are certain things that we can do, like executive functioning, whether they're having trouble with sustained focus or initiating and shifting from activity to activity, emotional control, self-monitoring. There's a lot of what I think is helpful in teaching a language to dialogue so that person can also be a advocate for themselves and say, hey, I know this about myself. I'm having trouble initiating a task, and these are the things that I need to do in order to get through my assignment or whatever it is. But then also behaviorally, I want parents to know and teachers to know that for every one thing that you say that's negative feedback, that you need five positives to make up for that. And so it's not that they're wanting to misbehave. It's just that neurologically they just can't. So it's really important for us to normalize, validate, and be inclusive in our response to things as parents and teachers.
Mm-hmm. My next question is, in doing this kind of work, what impact has this kind of work had on you as a um in the community? So like doing this kind of work, the work that you do now, how has that like impacted you in a positive way,
Yeah. So like in the community of like donor conception and fertility fraud or the community of like with my patients or both.
Yeah, the latter.
For the second part?
Yeah.
Okay. Um, so how has that impacted me? And I mean, really, I think a lot of it is that's a really good question. I do a lot of training and a lot of teaching. So I work with several of our students, our graduate students at the local universities. And they come here for the second part, kind of like they have to have this internship to get hours to graduate. And so a lot of what I do is supervising them and teaching them, about neurodiversity and how to be inclusive in their practice, how to read and assess psychoeducational evaluations, how to help advocate for the community and for their patients because I don't feel like a lot of it is really it's we talk about it in graduate school but we don't necessarily it's just kind of like a chapter or a one classroom but really when people are coming in we really have to meet them at their part of the world so I think that that's probably the biggest impact that I have in the community is helping train other therapists when they're early on in their therapy journey to be more inclusive.
My last question in all of this is, what can people take away from this conversation? How can, doing things like the work that you do now, how can they sort of sort of help patients, with those struggles, become more independent and can really live a more productive life.
That's a great question. I think the first thing, and this is what I tell a lot of my graduate students, is you really have to look at a lot of the advocacy groups and the community leaders that, and listen to them when they say that, I think of the best example I have is, when we're looking for like autism, for example. And, for the longest time, the gold standard was, teach social skills and, teach them these kind of masking type qualities. But when you start to look into the advocacy groups that say, we don't want social skills, we don't want to learn these things that help us mask. We want you guys to understand us. And so really the biggest thing is, like I said, just meeting them at their part of the world. But I tell them that they're always learning, that just because today this is what our gold standard is, doesn't mean that in 5 years from now that we're not going to grow and we're not going to change. But we have to have that, the people that this is helping, and we have to be listening to them and really understanding what's working and what's not working. And so I think that that's kind of the most important thing, is just, constantly, we're just constantly growing.
Yeah, and also the education because there's ableism and all these biases and stuff. So that's also another key.
Right. So, and I would love to hear more about that. I feel like that's something that we don't really talk about enough is ableism. What are kind of the things that people that you want people to know about that? Or what are the misconceptions with that?
Yeah, that's cool.